Coming up in this masterclass, we will be looking at compliance and audit trails.
I think they really need to focus on this now, and we're working with a number of banks for purely this purpose.
So that's one example, but with new regulations coming in and pending, such as SEPA or Basel III, I'm assuming that there will be another or more such compelling examples. So, Simon, what about legacy records and how to archive them and capture them?
So legacy records, and PPI is an example of legacy records, but all banks have got a vast amount of legacy records in all sorts of formats. The example we talked about there was talking about microfiche, but for us legacy records could be paper, could be fiche, could be electronic databases, which are old formats. I think the important thing is whenever you're defining a strategy for your legacy records renewals, it's important to make sure that there's a compelling reason to affect the transformation. That might be legislation, PPI or MiFID or SEPA, for example. It could be the pure cost or the risk of holding paper documents. So there's many reasons why you might want to transform your legacy records, but I think HP's approach is to make sure that we work with the customer to match both the legacy records with a compelling event, and that creates a business issue that we can then fund the transformation for.
Do you have an example that you could give me?
Yeah, sure. I mean, generically what we try to do is kind of transform the records in a stepped process. So we would map out this whole transformation process, prioritise the legacy records. The first thing we would do is we would scan and OCR that information. So rather than just having flat images of paper or statements, we try and lift intelligence from that and store that securely in a database that the customer then has access to. But more importantly, we need to make sure that that's also able to be integrated with the rest of the big data that the customer has. There's no point building a separate stovepipe of legacy information. We need to map it into the rest of the big data and provide analytics and search across all of the data that they have. So generically that would be our approach. A good example is a bank that needed to improve their loan book. There was a compelling reason that they needed to analyse their mortgages, their home loans, because there's a home loan crisis and they needed to identify all of the bad loans and pass them over to a separate entity. The issue was that the loans and the loan paperwork was in paper format, and paper format at each branch. So very, very difficult for anybody centrally to understand and analyse their loan book in any way, shape or form. So our solution was to first of all create, if you will, a mobile scanning unit where we could go around branch by branch and scan all of the paper documentation into a central repository. And once that was done, provide the analytic tools for them to understand their loan book, work out which were the risks, risky debts, and move those over to a separate entity.
A topic that's related to legacy archiving and capturing is of course compliance and audit trails. So Ian, what can you add in terms of these topics?
Well, compliance and audit trail and regulation and governance is a very complex area, and it's getting more and more complex as more of the regulations, Basel goes to 2.5 to 3 and so on, and a number of those regulations, MiFID for example 2015 will go live, Basel will go live next year. These have to be complied with, and the fact that they're being changed all the time, the banks have got an ever-moving target. So one of the things they have to do is fully understand the implications of those regulations, and secondly build their systems around them so that they are compliant and try to be compliant for the future. So they're sort of second guessing where it's going. And really the second guessing is fairly straightforward, in as much as best execution you have to have an audit trail of the information passing through the system. You need to be able to store it, to archive it for whatever period is required for that particular piece of information. You need to be able to retrieve it and retrieve it in a sensible manner, quickly and accurately, without the risk of it being lost or delays and fines and so on. And various sign-offs or signatures need to be present and need to be stored. So with all those regulations in their various formats, it all comes down to having sensible and well-structured and designed workflow and processes, so that you can take all the legacy data that Simon's talked about, digitise that, put it through an on-ramp process we call on-ramp, so it's bringing it into a digital format, and then put it into a storage medium where it can be retrieved, archived, viewed, stored for as long as is actually needed.
Are the current processes compliant already, or and would it in that case only take longer to find the papers, or are they not compliant at all?
The process of storing paper can be compliant, but it's quite often very difficult to make sure that every process is put in place. So it has to be recorded, the fact that the paper exists. The paper then has to be moved to a storage area. It has to be properly catalogued in that storage area and classified so it's kept for the right amount of time. That storage area has to be safe and secure and have various fire systems in place. And the retrieval has to be practiced so that you can bring the information back when you need to. And then, of course, you're then processing it again for whatever regulation, and you've got a piece of paper again. So you've then got to take that information and perhaps digitise it as part of the regulation.
The SEPA deadline is already coming up in a few months. MiFID II is not too long away either. How much time have banks got to digitise enough? Presumably they will not be able to digitise everything.
I think time is running out. I think they really need to focus on this now. And we're working with a number of banks for purely this purpose. Not necessarily to make them compliant, but looking at digitising their records, on-ramping their records, which then has a knock-on of being compliant. But they really need to focus on this. It can be as simple as taking an analogue faxing system. So if they're using analogue faxes in their office at the moment, if they implement some sort of network faxing system, then it's going to, by its very nature, have some audit trail, whereas the previous analogue faxing system didn't. And then it can, of course, the data can be stored and retrieved and so on through other processes. So some of the solutions are very, very simple, some of them more complex.
So it sounds like, on the one hand, it's more about being more efficient, and that will mean that it's compliant as well. On the other hand, it also sounds like they'll have to comply with regulation, and in order to do that, they will have to digitise. Am I understanding that correct?
Absolutely, and I think the regulators are getting tougher and the fines are getting bigger.
In the fourth chapter, we're looking at the branch of the future and what's next in store for banks.